later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure, eventually, 12 o'clock. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. The next day, later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later,
17 years later.
meanwhile, 6 hours later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 1 death to society later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 2 hours later, epilogue the next day, meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m., 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue, several home-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then, what follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage, the next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback, the very next evening, 1 hour later, the next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, the next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later,
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
3,000 whoop-whoos later, soon after, later, moments later, the next morning, many unbearable hours later, 82 kilometers later, a little later, 3 hours later, 1 season later, many secret parties later, moments later, 1 nap later, 1 very long digested track later, 6 months later, 1 pathetic short story later, many minutes later, 3 hours later, the next morning, 1 shift later, the next day, the next morning, later, the next morning, later that night, the next day, 1 weekend of pampering later, 1 hour later, late again, you get the idea, 8 semesters later, 5,000 celebrities later. Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later,
A few minutes later.
next morning, later that night, the next evening, one operation later, 1 million, zillion, jillion, billion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning, later, 1 hour later, 7 months later, the next Christmas, several long days later, many toys later, 12 sleepless hours later, one beautiful Christmas morning later, the next morning,